I don't know if I can wait another month and a half, 2 months for this. This is shabby. Kind of bad. Man, I look like a Sasquatch. Anyway, so, yeah. You can tell how often I look in a mirror, huh? This side looks like an actual beard. Well, mostly like an actual beard. This side looks almost like, I don't know why the hair is so much lighter on this side. It is what it is, I guess. Anyway, Island of Dr. Moreau is the one I'm playing around with most right now. I'm doing a little side project every now and then, but I have to say, like, I get into the idea of the Island of Dr. Moreau. Like, I haven't even really gotten into the main part of the story yet. But the start of, how to phrase this, I'm struggling with, and it's one of the things that you deal a lot with when doing National Novel Writing Month, is the tendency to start a story and then want to fix it as you go instead of just barreling through the writing process. The thing about this story is it takes some world building to do. And so the world building involved in this setting is to set up a world in which the Island of Dr. Moreau happened. And so you start with the Island of Dr. Moreau having happened in the past. And I'm going with, the stories are not quite exactly what happened, but they're good enough. So it's sort of like unreliable narrator. And part of that is the Island of Dr. Moreau starts you off with a guy who shipwrecks, and I believe it's a shipwreck, ends up picked up and saved by Dr. Moreau and brought to his island, where he's introduced to people who are created from living animals. So basically, if you were to take a dog and give it cosmetic surgery that would make a supermodel or something like that, you could essentially make a supermodel out of dog. And that's sort of the idea that they were going for with the Island of Dr. Moreau. They take it a little bit further in Island of Dr. Moreau, where they mix animal parts. So you have pigs, hyenas, and dogs, or pigs, hyenas, and baboons, all woven together into one animal. And that's less plausible in the idea that tissue rejections would basically kill that animal outright real quick. But theoretically, the cosmetic surgery on an animal to make them look human, that's more plausible. I use the term loosely. But if we go with that premise, we just assume that the narrator on the Island of Dr. Moreau is somebody who doesn't understand what's being done fully. And with that in mind, we have these animals turned into humans living on this island. That's sort of the backstory I have to establish. But in order for my story to work, it has to be something that breeds true. So cosmetic surgery does not breed true. Something has to be changed. And part of that is because I want it to be I debate whether or not I want it to be a later generation. So you can have Island of Dr. Moreau happens in the late 1800s. I want this to be something that happened, that the stories that I'm working on to be sort of like one or two generations later. But you can't do that with a single generation of animals and have them expected to survive. Because I want to do it in like the 1980s or something like that. Because I mean, I could do it steampunk, and that's part of the reason why I'm struggling with it right now, is because there is the possibility of um, establishing the story at an earlier time frame. But I feel like that's not quite where I want to go with it. It's hard to say. I think it depends on where the characters go to develop. Because really, I mean, the characters we're going to end up dealing with are basically the chimeras, the creatures that have been changed to be something else, and the Professor X type character, which is the Count of Saint Germain, a somewhat famous, actually historically existent person. Count Comte de Saint Germain is supposed to have lived between 1691 and 1784. And that is sort of like he clouded a lot of the stories of his origin so that nobody could really tell who he is and where he's from. But the mythology behind him is that he's an alchemist, and he's supposed to have lived a very long life and maybe immortal. This says here, in order to deflect the inquiries as to his origin, he would make far-fetched claims such as being 500 years old, leading Voltaire to sarcastically dub him the Wonder Man, and that he is a man who does not die and who knows everything. And that's a bit of a steep claim. And it's supposed that he died in, where was it? Did he go to England? He was acquainted with Prince Charles Hesse-Kassel, who also had interest in mysticism and several secret societies. So he spent time in Germany. So I think that's where he ended up being. So I think he supposedly died in Germany, which there's documentation of his assets being distributed and a burial in a local graveyard or something, some such thing. But it has been supposed by some mysticism groups over the subsequent years that he faked his death and is continuing to move about the world. So this is very Highlander. This is somebody who's hundreds of years old and cannot die, and appears to die out and show up somewhere else. And that's a very kind of common mysticism claim. So it's not a huge problem to play with that a little bit. But what that gives us is a Professor X style main character who we can put in any time period. My inclination is to use one that I'm more familiar with, the era of our current time frame, our pop culture. Because when you really come down to it, the Island of Dr. Moreau was a story told It was written, I believe, in 1893. And that was a time period where vivisecting live animals was something that medical science did, which is part of the reason the story exists. It's a commentary on that practice, which is disturbing. But it's also a commentary on society at the time being animalistic and how they have a tendency to be very kind of no better than animals, and that we pretend we're better, but we're not. But at the same time, questioning the idea of forcing animals to be civilized being sort of a crass, arrogant belief that we have the right to dabble in the realm of gods. And so there's some of that commentary there. So the whole story is very steeped in the idea of that commentary. It's like a criticism of the contemporary time to which it was written in. And I feel like to a certain degree, I want to follow that tradition and use it to criticize or discuss our own time frame. But I think the problem I have with that approach is how loose can I play with the science? And this is what one of the hurdles of National Novel Writing Month is. You have to get past the point where you're editing this kind of stuff in the beginning. You just have to write. That's what National Novel Writing Month is. You sit and you write. What you write doesn't have to make sense. You need 50,000 words by the end of this month. That's how this game works. And you don't have the luxury of the time to fiddle around with like, oh, does this, do we do that? What if we do this instead? What if we go back and change this? You don't have the time. There is no time for you to be doing that. But it's really hard to turn that part of my brain off. And it'd be one thing if it were just, is their name Tabitha or is it Alexi? What are the names that I'm going to give the characters? What are the personal struggles they're going to have to deal with? Because if I set this in the 1960s, that's totally different than if I set this in 1987 or 2000. Where do I set it time frame wise? And we have that whole time period between roughly 1900 and 2000 to play with, because the Count de Saint Germain, if he's an immortal, it doesn't matter where we put him. But if the island of Dr. Moreau took place in the late 1800s, then how long a lifespan do the remaining animals have if they can't produce a second generation? If they're just cosmetically altered to become human, that's so tricky. Well, I mean, we are including a immortal alchemist, so we're going to be able to include some mysticism. I wonder if and here's the other part of the problem with it's actually a common problem with writing in general, is starting your story too early. And what I mean by that is there's a tendency, it's like, where to start a story? Well, you start at the beginning. Well, no, you never really start a story at the beginning. The story of Huck Finn isn't the screaming on the birthing table of Huck Finn. The beginning of Moby Dick doesn't start with Captain Ahab being born. That's the start of the life of the character, The start of the story is when the beginning of the important moments, that key moment that makes this the story, the reason you're paying attention to the story in the first place. Buzz Lightyear and Woody, their journey really starts not when they wake up as toys in Toy Story, but when they become friends and the understanding of their role together in the life of their child. I don't mean it as their child like they had a kid together, but you get what I say. So the basic idea is like there's a key aspect of every story, and sometimes if it's a multi-novel story, that can be a little harder to peg down. But if you're looking at the saga of Star Wars, the first movie can stand alone on its own. If you just did the first Star Wars movie they made, it is a standalone. You could be done at that point. But they made 2 more stories because that story was addressing the Skywalker family and the consequences to the whole galaxy of that family conflict, and the fall of an empire. Those are key factors. The start of the story that we see when we see the original trilogy is not when Luke is born. It's when he gets the call to adventure and takes that call to adventure, and the result of what that adventure is. So, by the same token, the island of Dr. Moreau is part of the backstory, but it isn't the story. The story I'm working on is different from the island of Dr. Moreau. So I need to start telling the story in the place where that story happens. You know, the call to adventure, the moment that happens, and the subsequent adventure that results from that call is the story. Now, the trick to doing a novel writing of any kind is to stitch into that story structure the backstory. So instead of doing a giant info dump of the Count de Saint Germain and the island of Dr. Moreau and whether or not there's interbreeding and the meeting of the 2 sides and all of that, that's covered in sort of backstory. When you have 2 characters interacting, you have 2 of your main characters who came from the island of Dr. Moreau interacting with each other and talking about, like, you weren't like this back on the island. And you give them a little bit of that backstory, but you don't just info dump it. So you have to weave it in tightly into the rest of the story, just in little bits, so that you're actually telling 2 stories. You're telling the story of the adventure here, but you're telling the story of everything that came before at the same time. And that it's tricky to stitch in the at the same time story aspects. It really has to be like, to a certain degree, it's sort of like the commentary I was saying, where Island of Dr. Moreau was commentary on the events happening in the world at the same time. So what happened on the island was a microcosm of what was happening in the rest of the world. And you have to do this sort of same thing where when you encounter certain things in the course of the story, the adventure, they highlight factors that parallel what happened before and are establishing details for the characters. And that's all very contingent on how I set my timeline. So I've been skeletonizing my story right now, which is not usually how I do it. I think I mentioned it last time, where I usually favor doing a pantser style. And by pantser, not panther, pants-er. Pantsing a story is essentially just doing it by the seat of your pants. You sit down and you say, Island of Dr. Moreau meets X-Men. These are my 5 characters. This is the situation I put them into. Let's see how these characters decide they're going to behave. And just go. That's usually how I do it. But I feel like I don't know if it's a factor of maturing in writing style or if it's just a change in writing style. But I feel like I need to be able to lay it out a little bit more. The classic story structure of, the call to adventure, the adventure, the rising and falling action, all of those 5-act plays and the hero's journey aspects. I feel like I favor adding those in to get a better sense of a more epic story. But I worry sometimes that I'm getting too hung up on those details, and I just need to start pantsing again. But what I was saying before was I've skeletonized out the basic idea of what I want the story to do, basically what the moral of the story is, but I don't have a sense fully of the setting yet, and I hesitate to start writing if I don't have that, because that could be a major rewrite later, and I don't like to set up something that I have to major overhaul. So like I said, the difference between 1900, 1940, 1960s, 1980s, and 2000s, they're all very substantially different from one another. The relationships of characters to one another and their environment are all very distinctly important aspects. It's if you're doing a story in the 1940s, I mean, you're dealing with the fact of the World War and the start of women in the workplace. And so that changes drastically from the civil rights movement to computer technology to, I don't know what to call it when we hit 2000. 2000 just made the world a mess. I guess it depends to a certain degree what effect it has on the overall message of the story. But I also think like questioning where along the spectrum of magical to sci-fi I go with it is an important question. So what we're looking for is the backstory includes, and that's really what I've been writing out. So these are pieces that I'll have to weave in to the rest of the story. But the backstory starts us off with the immortal Count de Saint Germain encountering a friend and meeting this person out in a rural estate where he's passing away. And he tells the story of finding the island of Dr. Moreau, which then leads the Count de Saint Germain to go find the island and then sort of save and rescue the creatures on Dr. Moreau's island, at least some of them. So there's a part of me that feels like if it were just cosmetically operated on animals, you could have the Count de Saint Germain, the near immortal being, the alchemist who created the elixir of life. You could have him be the one who perpetuates the lifespan of these animal people. So you could have him find them in the early 1800s or early 1900s and stabilize them, and then at a certain point bring them to the mainland. But you may also just simply be able to say that he recognizes some of the aspects of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein being applied to, and Mary Shelley's Frankenstein uses references to famous alchemists, Agrippa, and I can't even remember. Did they mention Paracelsus? They might have. At any rate, there's reference in Mary Shelley to famous alchemists, and their approach to creating the Frankenstein's monster was very similar to the creation of homunculus, which were something that Paracelsus mentioned in his treatise on alchemy. How I know all that is a fun adventure in storytelling for another time, I suppose. But that does propose the potential for the creatures on the island of Dr. Moreau to have been cobbled together from more than one creature. And it does add the question of whether or not they can breed true. Or maybe not even breed true. I mean, there's some aspect of chimerism where you can, in humans, there's mosaicism. It's a form, it's also sometimes called chimerism. And it's named that because of the chimera from Greek mythology. The Greco-Roman concept of the chimera was a creature with the body of a lion, the front legs of a lion, I think, the back legs of a goat, with a serpent's tail, a dragon's head, a lion's head, and a goat's head, all on the same body. And I can't remember if it had wings. It might have had dragon's wings. And so that's a chimera. It's basically stitching together three animals. But that term has become applied to things that are actually done in modern science, where they've taken, I think it was they took a chicken embryo inside its egg, and they inserted cells from a quail into the developing embryo and allowed it to develop into a full creature that had mixed traits. And it's sort of this sort of chimerism happens naturally when two twins in utero actually get, they surmise this is what is happening, but these two twins get merged into a single being. Now, identical twins that can happen to, that usually ends up resulting in a person with extra components. So they might have extra digits, and that suggests that it was somebody who was developing into two people and then merged back into one, and some of those redundant traits between the two of them didn't fully merge. But when it happens between fraternal twins, where you have two people who are not genetically identical that merge, you can get some interesting indicators. So eyes of different colors. You can even get like stripy patterns on skin where one area is just slightly different tone and responds differently to light or things like that. And so it does exist. Chimerism does exist in naturally occurring states. And we've done it scientifically to creatures mixing across relatively similar family groups. So you could feasibly do that. And if you're going to throw in somebody who has the panacea, the cure-all, the key to the elixir of immortality, you can kind of use it as a hand wave over the fact that their bodies should be ravaged by sickness and rejection if they're not treated in some way. And you can do that in most any time period. So you can do that with basically the medicine of the panacea, the philosopher's stone, the elixir of life, can kind of hand wave away a lot of those complications. But I think the hurdle I'm coming across is that works if you have the Count de Saint Germain fixing the problem. But what was what was Dr. Moreau using to do that? Because if he's just stitching together baboon limbs onto a pig's body, that's not the same thing. So I don't know. And I think the other hurdle I have with the general idea of cosmetic surgery on animals to make them human hits the hurdle of, I don't care how human you make a dog look. If a human were a dog in mental space, they'd be a freaking idiot. Not that I don't know some idiots. I know some people who are just blaringly idiotic. But that's not really the point. The point is, if you want your protagonists to be animals that are uplifted, is a term that's sometimes used for that, it's hard to just say like, oh yeah, we took a chicken and made it into a human. Not without some rather serious mental augmentation, guys. You really need to up that just a little bit. So yeah, that's a hurdle I have to overcome because it's going to dictate how the rest of the story goes. I mean, I'm writing backstory right now, so that's not a huge problem because I haven't hit the main part of the story where it's going to come into play about where are they in the timeline. And I'm debating, like, the story I want to tell is sort of a critique of our modern world and the way we conduct ourselves and dehumanize each other to a certain degree. But you can tell that story in 1960 with the civil rights movement. And you can tell that story in the follow through or the after effects of World War II, where people are looking at the consequences of concentration camps, dehumanizing of an entire population of people, euthanizing, eugenics. I mean, you can tell that story relatively well. I feel like it's a little bit harder to tell a few other stories, which is, I think, where I'm tripping myself up. My inclination is to build a setting that's it's good enough for more than one story or adventure. And if I want to tell the story of that weirdness that is adolescence, where you pass through adolescence and you feel alien, like you don't belong in the rest of society, and you're trying to figure out where you belong, that's a common trope for an adolescent coming of age story. But it also is a story you can tell through the lens of somebody who literally isn't human, but is trying to figure out where they belong in society. And my sense of that time frame comes about as a story of somebody in the 80s and 90s going through that. So it's a little bit harder. And I think the other hurdle you have to overcome with that kind of story is it becomes less meaningful today the further back you go in time. Because the things we have in our lives today are vastly different. Like that sense of like remoteness and alienation of being in a non-big city environment in a time where internet doesn't exist is vastly different than a story that takes place where I can pull out a device from my pocket that has more power than the Apollo moon landing had. You know, that's a vastly different scenario. And I don't think I want it to be truly modern in the sense that I don't. It's weird because there's an aspect of modern existence that makes a lot of those styles of suspense and action stories harder to do well. Because, like, I think of movies like Indiana Jones, and where you have to figure out, like, he has to go research something, so he has to go to a special library to go do that. Like, if you did that now, he could just pull up Google, search the total sum of human knowledge on the internet. That's a bit of an exaggeration, but somebody made a similar remark at one point about how it would be almost impossible to do classic horror movies now because you can't have this nobody believes the villainous monster is real because they didn't see it and it sounds too fake to be real when I can literally take a video of it and send it through the airwaves to everybody else within 100 miles of me if I wanted to. I could post it to the entire world on YouTube. Just pull out my phone, live stream to YouTube, and you've got a video of the El Chupacabra or the Jersey Devil. You can't have a Jason or a Freddy or a Michael Myers now when you can call the cops from inside the closet of a house without any power. Like he cut the power. Oh well, he cut the phone line. Oh no, I'll just use my cell phone because it's not a problem. Like, how do you do a movie like that now? Cell phones literally change everything. You're trying to flee somebody in your car and you find out that they've damaged a component of the car so it dies on the side of the road. Just call a tow truck. Call the police and call a tow truck. You've got a phone with you. It's not like you have to run 3 miles down the road to the nearest building to find the next phone. You're not isolated in the middle of nowhere with no access to anything at all. And it's just like, okay, yes, cell phones really changed the modern horror movie. You can't do the standard traditional ones that we know from when we were younger. And by the same token, a lot of modern technology changes how we interact with science and each other. And that major change, I feel like, would take a lot of work to get the story to fit right. But I think the other problem I come across is if I'm not talking about modern times and the struggles within modern times with modern technology, then I'm not making commentary on modern times. I'm making commentary about our past. I know, it's just one of those, like, there's a right way to do it, and I don't think I've found the sweet spot for it yet. And it may just be one of those things where I just write the story, find out when I'm done the story that that's all wrong, and have to rewrite it in an entirely different time frame, changing key concepts. Just may have to do it that way. That's just the nature of doing some of this stuff. But as I've been sitting here thinking about it, I do feel like there is a little bit of space for, I think, that sort of science optimism that happened after World War II. That sense of like wonder. We've split the atom. As horrifying as what we did with it when we split it was, we figured out, like, the dawning of the atomic age was a wonderful moment for, science will solve all modern man's common problems. So it's like, it's that sort of optimism that led us to think about things like the Jetsons and Buck Rogers and those types of explorations of where technology and science can lead us into the future. I don't think Buck Rogers was a particularly optimistic one, was it? I'm trying to remember. Buck Rogers was frozen in stasis or something like that, and woken in the 21st century when Earth and Mars were at war, I think. Something like that. But anyway, you get what I'm saying. That atomic age, that kind of belief in, I feel like the moon landings and computers were just starting to really have a sense of what the potential was. That feels like it could be a fun space to play in. And I do feel like, to a certain degree, it's after a Rosie the Riveter moments, so you have the opportunity for a slightly less sexist setting, so that you can have male and female characters and not have to use the same mind frame of that sort of a woman's place is in the house. I mean, it's not as common, but we still sort of switched away from that. I mean, I'm not remembering a time when I was young. I'm remembering before me, so I may have some of my details off, but that may be a sort of a sweet spot. I'm trying to remember, when did Casablanca take place? Was that after World War I, or was that after World War II? Because I feel like there's also room for some of that film noir. That's hard too, because there is a sort of a desire to do a little bit of that Art Deco, Metropolis, Gotham City sort of feel to it. I don't know. I'm going to have to bounce my brain around it a bit more to really get a sense of where the spot's going to be. And I guess I'm going to have to really calculate on that. The rest of that story being the story being an important factor in deciding the time period that it takes place in. Because, yeah, I guess I'll have to sit here and think about it. We're about 45 minutes in, and I think that's a good place to call it for tonight. That's sort of my brainstorming for my National Novel Writing Month story idea. Well, actually, the idea was earlier this year, but I guess we'll call it 2020 writing. Anyway, Vision 2020 Visions. That's not bad. I might go with that. All right. Thanks for joining me for tonight. I will catch you. What's the next day? You might have nightmares tonight. Why? The vivisecting live animals? Yeah, I can see that potentially doing that. All right, so take care. Sweet dreams. Yeah, gotta do it. All right, I will catch you. What's the next day? What's today's date? I guess next day is Tuesday. So I will see you on Tuesday night. Until then, think happy thoughts.